and I'll let you guys take it from here.
Awesome. Let's see. Yeah, one more minute, so we'll let people get settled. Patrice has put that bit.ly in the chat, so you can click that bit.ly and you'll have access to view those slides. If you have a device like a cell phone or a tablet next to you, and you can use that QR code also to get access to those slides. And today, we're going to talk about the essential updates and practical applications to action and expression, our final principle, UDL principle, and this is going to be the last of our first series of UDL 3.0 webinars. So we're looking forward to thinking about what the next step is, but we're going to be talking about action expression, which is that blue column. Let's see. That bit.ly is going to remain in that chat. So I am going to kind of move forward and just do some of our logistics because we just hit time. So you can use that chat box at any time. Feel free to introduce yourself in there. Tell us where you're coming from, what's your name, what brought you here today. You can ask questions as we go along. We're going to try to keep our eyes on that chat. You can share an idea or even quote something that someone has said, quote something someone has said in the chat, or something that maybe Jenna or I have said that resonates with you. And you can also hyperlink some resources. Just make sure that you are choosing everyone in the chat versus host and panelists. So if you choose everyone, then everyone will be able to see your introductions. And so I see we got people coming in. The previous webinars, Kelsey, are on the website, on CAST's website. So when you go to the free webinar part, it'll say what's upcoming. And I think right now the only thing on there is this one today. And then you can look at the recordings and the slide decks from previous webinars. Hi, Wyatt. Good to see you. All right. So we got people coming in. Sherry's in the house. Nice to see you. See you're typing.
Thank you all for being here. This is great.
Yes. So as I said, that chat box, just choose that. It's actually on this version of this update of Zoom. It's called everyone instead of all panelists and attendees. And you can contribute. You can add somebody's name if you want to speak directly to them too in that chat. So our accessibility commitments, what are we committed to in terms of accessibility for this webinar? We have taken steps to make sure this deck is accessible. So we use the automatic check that Microsoft Office uses and PowerPoint. We've also checked manually to ensure a clear reading order for screen readers. We've given you this deck so you have access to it so you can personalize it as you see fit. You can make a copy of the slides and use them on your own and take notes on them, etc. We welcome any feedback you have on improving this experience. If some things are not accessible or it's not working for you, just let us know and we'll do everything we can to sort that out for you. My name is Melissa Sanjay. I am a Senior Professional Learning and Implementation Specialist at CAST. What that means is I get to work with any people from teachers to school leaders to district leaders to state leaders on the implementation of UDL, both in classrooms and school-wide. And we're moving into also working district-wide to think about the implementation of UDL and what supports UDL and supports all students to have access and agency. Prior to coming to CAST, I've been at CAST for about 6 years now. Prior to coming to CAST, I was first a social worker, then a teacher, and then a principal for a number of years in Boston's alternative high schools. Those are our schools for our students who have been pushed out or dropped out of their homeschool because the traditional environment didn't work for them. And so that's where I became passionate about thinking about how can we make all of our schools and spaces flexible enough to meet the needs of all students and have them all have access and agency in their learning. To sort of put my former self out of business to so those schools can keep those students. And I have with me my good friend Jenna. Jenna, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Jenna Gravel. I'm a senior research scientist at CAST, and I'm also right now currently serving as the interim chief research and development officer. And as part of my work at CAST, I co-chaired our process to update the UDL guidelines. I co-chaired that process with my colleague, Nicole Tucker-Smith, and with lots of you within the UDL community, many of you who are joining us today. So just a big thank you for your contributions to this process. of updating the guidelines, and we are so excited to explore the updates to action and expression with you today. I actually have been working on the guidelines since I was an intern with CAST, and so this was the very first iteration that we launched back in 2008. So this has just been a wonderful journey for me to kind of see the evolution of the guidelines and to learn from everyone's feedback and participation in more fully developing these guidelines to be a stronger tool.
I stopped share for just a minute because I'm seeing that people are having difficulty getting in. So what I'm going to do, Patrice, is
Uh-oh.
I'm going to share it with you, give you edit privileges, and then if you could figure out the sharing settings, that would be
Thank
helpful.
you. I'll troubleshoot with Bill. Just give me a moment.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks everyone for letting us know.
Yes, for sure. Okay, so I'm going to share our screen again. There we go. All right. So what is CAST mission? So as you heard, both Jen and I work for CAST, and CAST leads, inspires, and convenes a global community to design equitable, inclusive learning experiences through our universal design for learning framework. And when we're talking about universal design, our sort of working definition is that universal design for learning, UDL, is an educational framework based on research and the learning sciences that guides the development of flexible and accessible methods, materials, and environments that embrace variability, minimize barriers, and develop learner agency for all. So we're talking about access and agency, and in particular, we're talking about these action and expression guidelines in that process that Janet was telling us about, that she went through and updating and expanding these guidelines. So those enhancements that we're going to drill down in for this webinar, the action expression enhancements, we are going to be considering how we honor and value a wide variety of forms of communication. We're going to be talking about centering and valuing forms of expression that have been historically silenced or ignored by addressing biases. And we're going to talk about challenging exclusionary practices to build more accessible, inclusive spaces and systems. And so through the process of digging deeper into that content, we're hoping that you will understand the action expression enhancements, understand the research behind those enhancements. So Jenna's going to take us through some of the research and some of the process that they went through as they updated and enhanced them. And then we'll come up with some ideas for how we might use these enhancements in practice. And we're going to do that both with some ideas that CAST is bringing to the table, but also we're hoping to engage everyone on this call in that process and share with each other some of our ideas. So given that that's what we're hoping to get to today, I want you to just take a minute and think about what are your goals for today. Because in UDL, we know our goals are our brains are goal directed. And if we set an intention ahead of a learning experience, it will cue our nervous system to pay attention to what we need to reach that goal. So feel free to drop them in the chat, write them on a notebook next to you, whisper them to a neighbor or a pet, whatever you need to set that intention.
I like that option.
You like the whisper. I always tell your cat what your goal is, right? They won't tell anybody. All right. I'm just checking the chat to see. I'm hoping that the slides are working now. It looks like Patrice. Yes.
Yep, they seem to be working now.
Great.
Thank you, everyone.
And Heather's cat is invested in UDL. Yay. I'm excited. All right. So you want to take us away with this first new consideration?
Yes, I'm ready to go. So the first expansion that we wanted to explore together is this theme of honoring and valuing a wide variety of forms of communication. And this theme is actually woven across all of the guidelines for action and expression. But today we wanted to explore how this theme is incorporated into UDL guideline design options for interaction. And that's guideline 4 for those of you who like to have those association with the numbers. So one explicit example of the ways that Guidelines 3.0 really works to emphasize the importance of honoring and valuing a variety of forms of communication is with the updated consideration, vary and honor the methods for response, navigation, and movement. And this is consideration 4.1. So with previous iterations of the guidelines, especially with the action and expression principle, it certainly emphasized the importance of multiple means for response and navigation. That was definitely a theme that has been really explicit across all iterations of the previous guidelines. But with Guidelines 3.0, this version is really prompting us to consider the multiple ways that learners kind of physically embody the learning process. So we've added this notion of movement to this consideration. And Guidelines 3.0 is really kind of prompting us to take an asset-based perspective and think about this notion of honoring learners' varying methods for response, navigation, and movement. So in previous iterations, I think this idea of honoring, was kind of implied, but it really wasn't explicit. And so we wanted to make that explicit connection to honoring these multiple modes really explicit with 3.0. So as we mentioned, this was a whole process of updating these guidelines for version 3.0. This actually was a 4-year process. We began the process in 2020. And then we really stayed committed to listening to and learning from a diversity of individuals and groups. We knew at CAST that we really could not or should not engage in this process alone. And so because we were so committed to this being a community-driven process, it extended our timeline a little bit, but was so worth it. And we were able to learn from just so many individuals and groups along the way. We prioritize listening to and learning from practitioners, researchers, and young people themselves. We launched an advisory board made up of external scholars and practitioners. We had a guidelines collaborative, and I'm seeing some of the members of our guidelines collaborative today as participants, so thank you for joining. That guidelines collaborative was made up of our CAST colleagues representing different branches at CAST, as well as members within the UDL community and organizations who we'd partnered with. And then we had an incredible group of young people who made up our Young Adult Advisory Board. And this board was made up of young people ages 18 to 22 who were just so eager and so passionate in terms of sharing their ideas for designing more inclusive and more equitable learning environments. So we were just so lucky to learn from those different groups. And we also conducted 42 focus groups over the years. We had 181. The number is still in my head because we were just so grateful for everyone who participated. 181 participants in those focus groups. Again, some of you who participated in focus groups, I'm seeing your names in the participant list. So just a big thank you to those of you who were involved in this process. And we just learned so much. So with this slide, we wanted to kind of highlight some of the different themes that emerged across the advisory groups, across the focus groups, to help us make this update to this particular consideration. And first, we had some questions that started to emerge. So one of the questions was, how do we account and value different ways to move in space and to be with others? And there was a strong theme that previous iterations of the guidelines just really didn't take into account the importance of movement and how that's connected to learning as an individual and learning in community. There were other kind of wonders around how we honor the multiplicity of ways that learners physically embody learning, thinking about the way that learners might be quiet through the learning process, or maybe singing or walking or standing helps to engage in the learning process. And some members of focus groups and members of our advisory groups were saying we could do more with version 3.0 to really honor the multiplicity of ways that we're kind of embodying this process. And then another question that really kind of stuck with us throughout this process is, are we favoring one way of students demonstrating understanding over others? So those were some really powerful themes that were emerging across the community as we were exploring ideas for updating. And then it was so interesting to us because these same themes started to emerge out of our reviews of the literature. So we wanted to take a really balanced approach to this update where we were really committed to this being a community-driven process. And alongside that, we were really committed to learning from the research and trying to explore areas of the research that might not have been included in previous iterations of the UDL guidelines. And it was so interesting to see these themes that were coming out from the community emerging in the research as well. And Melissa and I were kind of laughing as we were preparing for this webinar that we could have tons of webinars just on the research, that we were really able to kind of immerse ourselves in different areas of the literature and learn for this updating process. But today we wanted to just highlight some examples. And if anyone wants to go into the research more deeply through the chat or in questions later, please feel free to do that. But we thought for today, we just highlight some examples. And one of the kind of areas of the research that was especially useful for updating this consideration, first was Gonzalez and Mall's research on funds of knowledge. This proved to be especially helpful for the update of this consideration, as well as considerations really across the updated version. And funds of knowledge refer to the cultural practices and bodies of knowledge that are embedded in the daily practices of families and learners. And this is one area of the research that really kind of helps us to think about how we're supporting student learning and how these funds of knowledge connect to support student learning. We also drew really heavily from Ladson-Billings' work on culturally relevant pedagogy. So this is a theoretical model that not only really focuses on student achievement, but also on affirming students' cultural identity and supporting students to develop critical perspectives that are going to challenge inequities. So this was very useful as we were kind of considering those multiple ways that students are going to embody the learning process and share their ideas. And then we were looking toward Paris and Alim's research on culturally sustaining pedagogies. So this kind of builds on the idea of culturally relevant pedagogies and emphasizes that notion of sustaining and perpetuating students' cultural and linguistic repertoires. And then we also were kind of drawing from Waytoller and King-Torius's work on that intersection of UDL in the culturally sustaining pedagogies. So we really had like a wealth of research here that was not included in previous iterations that proved to be so helpful to us as we were thinking about these ideas of honoring methods of response and really kind of embedding that notion of movement within this consideration.
Nice. So we're thinking about that and thinking about how that might look in practice. Some strategies that we came up with were things like give extra time for students to interact with the instructional materials, vary them to respond to the variability in terms of in range of motion and other kinds of variability. Offer different ways for students to respond beyond typical, such as pen and paper. And can they respond in a variety of ways, including movement? Offer options for physically interacting with materials. And then embed flexibility into the design of this space. So thinking about flexible seating, positioning, lighting, and having choices for students and how they settle and where they locate and where they do their work. And an example that we have here is it's actually an Apple ad, but it does give us an example of a lot of different technologies that help students and people access spaces and access experiences and interact differently with different experiences. So we'll play that for you now.
People think that having a disability is a barrier. But that's not the way I see it. You can catch up with friends.
Ready?
You can capture a moment with your family.
One face, small face, focus lock.
And you can start the day bright and early. You can take a trip to somewhere new. You can concentrate on every word of a story.
A bird began to sing. Jack opened his eyes.
You can take the long way home. Or edit a film like like this one.
See if it'll keep going.
When technology is designed for everyone, it lets anyone do what they love, including me.
So with that example, thinking about, we wanted to kind of turn the conversation to the group and ask, first of all, what questions do you have about honoring and valuing a wide variety of forms of communication, and or what strategies can you share with the group on ways to honor and value a wide variety of forms of communication? So you can, lots of people love that video. You can put that in the chat. Just let us know, what are some ideas? Any other new ideas came to you as we were going along, Jenna?
I'm excited to hear what people have to say. Yeah.
Let's see here. Just go ahead and drop it in the chat. What are you thinking in terms of ways you have or will honor honor a wide variety of forms of communication? Amanda says, our college has obtained access to technology such as body swaps, which is a VR tool, has been implemented in courses to support students interacting with job interview skills, conflict resolution.
Oh,
Oh, that's cool. Like an AI skills lab in some ways, sounds like. Well, it's asking if anyone has a document of her dreams with links for free and affordable accessibility resources. Let's see if we can crowdsource that, Wyatt.
I like that idea. Yes.
VR tools and evaluations, closed captioning on all videos. Nice. Hear how they're comfortable in the chat. Come off mute, drop an emoji. Yeah, for sure. Use the chat, go to a breakout room. We'll often do that in trainings too, where people can type in a document or they can have a conversation at a table and in person. Nice, thank you. Keep them coming. All right. I think it is important to create hoops. It just jumped. Humanizing environments in our classrooms so students and instructors can feel more comfortable communicating their needs, goals, and students can feel empowered to move and learn in a way that works for them. Flexible acknowledgement of access needs to be from the instructors too. Artistic, mind mapping, nice. Anything you're seeing, Jenna?
I love that point about creating those humanizing environments. I think that sometimes that need to ask for a different option might feel stigmatizing in some way. And if we're working to build communities where asking for the tools that we need to communicate effectively is built into the environment, I think that's so important. So I really appreciate that point.
Nice.
Recognizing silence as a way of expression as well. I think that's so important. That's one thing I know I've thought about in my own practice. Oftentimes, we would do professional learning workshops or other kinds of workshops where, we would give people the chance to move into small groups instead of one big whole group. And I kind of thought of that as the option. And then we would have students or participants say to us, actually, I'd love the chance to just work independently. So I really started to try and build that into the design, that it would be a whole group, a small group, or just a chance to be reflecting with some quiet time is also really important.
Nice. Patrice, there's a question about how can we get these comments later. I'm wondering if you can save the chat.
I was wondering the same thing. Everyone's got great ideas. We got to get these captured.
Yeah, and we can put that with the materials on the website.
Awesome.
Awesome. All right, well, let's head into centering and valuing forms of expression that have been historically silenced or ignored by addressing bias.
Yes, so this is the next theme that we wanted to focus on today. And again, that theme is really woven across all of the guidelines for action and expression. But today we wanted to explore how this idea is incorporated into UDL Guideline 5, and that's design options for expression and communication. And so the most kind of explicit connection is to consideration 5.4. And this is address biases related to modes of expression in communication. And we can definitely say that previous iterations of the guidelines have certainly emphasized the importance of multiple modes of expression and communication. From the very beginning, from version 1.0 that was launched in 2008, I think that's a really strong piece of that version, is this really strong emphasis on these multiple ways of expressing ideas and communicating with one another. But this is a new consideration in version 3.0, and this consideration is really prompting us to address individual and systemic biases that are serving to devalue some forms of expression and communication and prioritize others. So this is a new consideration that's really prompting us to think about what forms of communication and expression are being silenced, which ones are we ignoring in the design of the learning environment. So again, we were just so grateful for all of the input across the UDL community and our advisory groups. And for this one, I wanted to just kind of illustrate this input with a quote that we were able to learn from a participant who joined us. And I'll read this quote aloud, and I think it really helps to represent this big theme that prompted us to create this new consideration. So one participant shared, multiple means of expression helps teachers understand to be really focused on their goal and know what you're assessing. And there's multiple ways to express your knowledge, but it doesn't interrogate or address the bias that, at least in the US, seems to happen around the written word. So in the US, the written word is held higher. And so we get questions like, well, students, got to write. What are they going to write? So are there ways that the guidelines could push on that before the question even comes out? So again, this was a quote from a participant in a focus group during our updating process. It was really kind of starting to represent a big theme that was coming out and prompted us to think about maybe we do need a new consideration that explicitly goes after biases related to modes of expression and communication.
So we got one.
That's right. And this slide probably looks familiar because I just used this slide to share about the research behind consideration for variant honor modes. But I wanted to kind of come back to this to show how these areas of the research were so useful to us when we were updating the guidelines for action and expression, and really across all of the principles. So I wanted to come back to just how this idea of funds of knowledge in culturally relevant pedagogy and culturally sustaining pedagogies, and then Waytoler and King-Torius's work on kind of merging and exploring the intersection of UDL and culturally sustaining pedagogies. This really prompted us during our process to really stay firmly rooted in an asset-based lens, and to be thinking about how are we really valuing and honoring the different ways that students and their families want to be communicating with us, and the different forms of communication that are valued by the students in our classrooms. So it feels a little repetitive to come back to the same research, but I kind of did it intentionally just to show how significant this work was to us as we were working on this updating process.
Great. So when we think about what is that, how does that show up in practice? How does that addressing those biases show up in practice, and how do we work with our students? So some common biases that you tend to find if you're working with teachers, or you're a leader, or you're like working with your fellow faculty to think about these things. Sometimes we'll find that people believe learning by reading a physical book is greater than using text-to-speech software on a digital text. Or we'll find that people believe mental math calculations are more rigorous than jotting or drawing visuals. Or as Jenna just pointed out, sometimes people believe writing to demonstrate understanding is better than speaking, drawing, or using digital media to demonstrate your understanding. Art made with paints is sometimes thought as better or more rigorous than digital art. Working solo is sometimes seen as harder than working with others, but then other people might believe that working with others is harder than working solo. And then working without scaffolds is better than working with scaffolds. So we have this little video to show you, and I'll come back to that other slide in a minute. I just, in the moment, decided to reorganize the slides. But we have this little video to show you that kind of puts a point on some of those things, and it may help you think about how do you talk to other people about it, and how do you use this metaphor to help other people think about things differently and address bias. This is Shelley Moore. She is a special educator out of Vancouver, Canada, and she does a lot of these little videos. So if you haven't seen her series, I recommend them highly.
Welcome to 5 More Minutes, useful videos in about 5 minutes that support the teaching and learning of all students. I'm your host, Shelley Moore. Today's episode is called Decriminalizing Supports. So today, I am gifting you with a poem. May I present to you a 5 More Minutes video in Susonian verse. Every morning of every day, what supports do you rely on to help you along the way? I mean, I wake up in the morning, my phone honks, chimes, and blasts my faves as I struggle to get out of bed to music horns and crashing waves. Our coffee brews with the push of a button or sometimes on its own, with programmable toasters and microwaved eggs as we look at the schedules of our day on the phone. We get into our car with a keyless remote and our seat adjusts to our height. We program our GPS device and then choose the guiding voice that's just right. We have options of radio, podcasts, or books to listen to as we drive, or we pick up a friend on the way to our work to chat with as we offer a ride. We talk to our colleagues about questions and topics throughout our day as we work. We bring and share snacks to those who may have forgot and are hungry while they do paperwork. At the end of those extra hard weeks, or maybe the last few days before Christmas break, you might even catch us with a beverage in hand or a little extra something in our shake. Now let's change our perspective to those who are scholars, students who are very much like us, just a little bit smaller.
Did it again.
Students who, like me, had to sit on their hands so they wouldn't count with their fingers to make sure it was math they could understand. Or those who are only allowed to show their learning in one way rather than offering choice or whether they want to go or if they want to stay. Using calculators or spell check are all seen as them cheating. They aren't allowed to talk to others and must be in rows while they're seating. Trying to monitor supports for all these different kids just makes us weary, forgetting we all have a reader and scribe in our pockets and we all know her as Siri.
Hello, Shelley Moore.
We are running around trying to get to everyone we can. Rather than building in supports from the start, let's help everyone with the plan. We will never have enough staffing, funding, or time if we continue to retrofit supports instead of building it in as part of the design. But in order to do that, we have to let go of the thinking that supports are only for a few kids and they don't have to prove that they're sinking, and teaching instead when they need a support to regulate their learning in others so they know how to push themselves further instead of relying on their mothers. Let's look at winter tires for the perfect example, a support we in the North use to this day. Between October and March, we change our tires over so that when it's icy, our car does not stray. I can guarantee you a mechanic would not say, "Winter tires," shh, someone might hear. Do you really want someone to know that you have them? Let's hope they have plugs in their ears. I can also bet that you wouldn't hear a tire shop owner complain that getting tires for winter should be something you prove you really need before you get chains. The best of all, and it still makes me laugh, is thinking about winter tire reviving, imagining if someone said to us, "Forget it, you'll lose the skill of bald tire driving." It's ridiculous to think about because the opposite is true. It's knowing when, not if you need tires, and then just trying to get through. Pushing through winter conditions, even if just for one day.
Oh, again.
Can you imagine the Coquihalla Highway if people actually drove this way? Now, if you see a driver with studs on in June, this might be a conversation upcoming. Or maybe they just moved to Canada and heard rumors to get ready because winter is coming. But guess what? It doesn't matter because I can definitely tell you that no one's been hurt by too many supports, but there's definitely been too many harmed by too few. Supports for all, this is the key. Let's not be our kids' education sequel, where supports weren't allowed and we weren't taught to believe that fair is not always equal. I will leave you with just one last story to remind you that support is not a bad thing. A boy named Zach came up to me in grade 8 and told me something that zinged. He said, "Miss Moore, you were my favorite teacher, but I definitely hated your class because you made me believe for a second that I might have been good at math. And then I got to grade 9. It put me back in my place. It made me remember that this is all just a race I've never been good at, a race that I've never won, that school's where I fail, not where I have fun." Think of your kids now. What kind of teacher do you want to be? One that supports them to believe in themselves, or make them feel that they must cheat and plea for their grades, for their pass, for their needs to be met? Who's in control now? Not the kids, I suspect. Let's support them from the start with choice, options, and plans. So when they look over their shoulder, they see a sweeper van. Let's teach kids the skills and decriminalize supports they need to prevail. They will self-regulate their learning and get what they need before they fail.
Patrice, will you put the slides in the chat again? Looks like some people had to rejoin and they lost their links. And there is going to be a recording, Stephanie. All right, so when we think about how do we value all forms of expression, some strategies, some practical things we can do is offer multiple ways to express what we know. Sometimes we could even co-design products with students. So thinking about this is the rubric, this is what I need you to demonstrate, and how do you think you could best demonstrate that, which really helps them bring in those funds of knowledge that you might not even be aware of, the ones that Jenna was talking about. Incorporate storytelling into your lesson designs as modes of expression and perception. So thinking about how do we model different ways of expressing ourselves so that they can be accessed by our students. Offering multiple ways to perceived, including historically marginalized modes, and communicate in multiple ways how modes of expression that align with the goal are equally valued. So making sure that you're not unintentionally signaling that one way is better than another way, and really building that classroom community around that. All right, so I see Cynthia's already started us off with some ideas for strategies to center and value forms of expression that have been historically silent. So we'd love to turn it over to the chat again. What questions do you have, and or what strategies can you share? So we have somebody here loving the idea of storytelling. And Linda brings up a good point that we want to make sure we're scaffolding our choice, right? So we want to offer choices for people to choose from with an explanation of what each choice is and what each choice means. Great, thank you. What are some other thoughts? Just go ahead and drop them in the chat. Well, that's a good idea. Alif is sharing with us that she sometimes writes a text before going somewhere so that in case it's too difficult to speak, she can express herself. Letting students use pictures, drawings in lieu of writing or speaking an answer. Explicit teaching of oral language skills. Yeah, that shows the value of it for sure. Anything popping out to you, Jenna?
I was going back to Elif's comment too about sometimes like the staff not always valuing her decision to use a text as opposed to using her voice to explain, and how that is. Like, thank you for sharing that example of a bias that was coming into play for you, of valuing one mode of communication over another.
Yeah.
Letting students create mind maps, another really exciting idea.
Great. All right, well, our last big theme is a huge one. Oh, we have a couple more. Tableau is a fun way to express. I love tableaus. Theater kid. I love tableaus.
I'm
Nice.
so glad we have the chat recorded because they're really
Yeah.
amazing ideas that everybody's sharing. So thank you.
Yes. Talking about the importance of AAC devices and having it be a first option. Great. Musical presentation. Icons and simple sentences. Thank you, Stephanie. Awesome. Well, this is not a small thing to do, is it, Jenna? Challenging exclusionary practices to build more accessible, inclusive space and systems.
That's right. Yes, this is the final expansion that we wanted to explore together today. And this is another theme that really is woven across the guidelines for action and expression, and really across all three principles included in Guidelines 3.0. But today we wanted to explore how this theme is incorporated into UDL Guideline 6, Design Options for Strategy Development. And the real explicit connection here is consideration 6.5, challenge exclusionary practices. And so this is kind of a fun story to tell in terms of how this new consideration emerged. So we, as we were working on the draft of version 3.0, we circulated that draft for public comment last March. So I'm not sure, I know some of you, I'm seeing some familiar names. Some of you joined us for our very first webinar that we did in March to share a very drafty version of Guidelines 3.0. And then we shared that draft for public comment during the month of March. And we were just so thrilled to have such a wonderful response to that period of public comment. We had 2 different surveys, 2 different formats, again, wanting to make sure we had multiple modes of expression. We got some good feedback from the field in terms of different survey formats to use, so that was wonderful. So we distributed our surveys, and we were able to receive 239 responses from individuals in 28 countries around the world, which was so amazing. And we were just so grateful for the feedback. And as we were, pouring over the feedback, really observing how people were really taking up the draft and really kind of exploring it and engaging with it and sharing some amazing feedback that only helped us to make version 3.0 even stronger and even better. So we were so grateful for that feedback. And what we did is my colleague Nicole Tucker-Smith and I, we used a coding process to analyze all the feedback that was coming in. And soon we started to notice this theme around like a feeling that the draft was kind of not quite pushing far enough. And that there was definitely a theme bubbling up among respondents sharing that they wanted a more explicit statement about the need to push to disrupt exclusionary practices and to design more inclusive spaces and systems. And we were learning that people felt like those ideas had been represented in different versions of the guidelines all along, right? I think those ideas are kind of implied in previous iterations, but it was really amazing to see this theme emerge that people were asking for a much more explicit statement. Even in the changes that we started to make in the draft, they wanted something even more, even stronger, a stronger statement. So I think that's just kind of a beautiful example of this community-driven process, that this challenge exclusionary practices consideration was not even a part of the draft, but because that theme emerged, we were able to create this new consideration, incorporate it into this version 3.0. And we wanted to just kind of share a little bit more specificity around some of the themes that emerged. It was interesting to learn that a lot of people found or we're feeling that previous iterations of the guidelines were so firmly rooted in supporting individuals with disabilities. And that idea of a consideration around challenging exclusionary practices felt like that could even more fully ground this version 3.0 in supporting people with disabilities, as well as people who didn't identify as having disabilities, but they kind of wanted that strong statement. And there was a lot of other feedback kind of sharing with us a need for a stronger emphasis around disability justice and thinking about like how we are advocating for the rights of people with disabilities and how could that kind of lens of disability justice be a little bit more centered in this guideline, in this version of the guidelines. So this was just a really wonderful part of the process for us. It was hard. We were kind of getting toward the end of the process and realizing, oh my gosh, like according to this feedback, we missed something. And so it prompted us to go back, review previous iterations and drafts we'd been working on, go back to focus groups. And then we also went back to the literature because like I said, we really wanted this process to be grounded in both the community-driven nature, but also really rooted in the research. So when we went back to the research, we were kind of looking in that area of disability studies. And this was a field of the literature that really hadn't been well represented in previous iterations. And we were drawing from lots of research within the field of disability studies to kind of create the draft more broadly. And returning to this field within the literature really helped us to start articulate this new consideration of challenge exclusionary practices. And for this webinar, we wanted to just kind of focus in, go really narrow and really just focus in on one article that was especially useful to us. And this was an article by Sue Baglieri and her colleagues. And it was published in 2011 in Teacher College Record. And it's called Reclaiming Inclusive Education Toward Cohesion and Educational Reform. Disability Studies Unravels the Myth of the Normal Child. And in this article, Sue Baglieri and her colleagues really kind of critically examine how dominant conceptions of inclusive education often overlook these assumptions that we have about the idea of normalcy. And these ideas of normalcy only serve to kind of perpetuate the socialization that we can have around the idea of average or normal, and then really perpetuate that marginalization of students with disabilities. So this was an article, and this article is representative of lots of articles that we are kind of reading within the disability studies literature. This was really pushing us to kind of broaden notions of what inclusion is all about and to think about incorporating all learners and to really value the notion of human diversity. And so that those strong themes that were coming out of the research, also coming out of the feedback on the draft, those kind of work together to help us create this, this last consideration that I think really makes that idea of designing more inclusive, more equitable spaces and prompting us to start to disrupt and challenge those exclusionary practices that perpetuate discrimination. I think it makes it that much stronger to have added this consideration. So thank you to all of you who gave us feedback on the survey for the draft.
Yeah, it was a very important last edition. It was the last edition to our expansion. So what does that look like in terms of strategies? So we can create structures to learn from learners' lived experience in order to surface exclusionary practices as well as address them. So really thinking about how do we gather data, how do we get information from our learners about what they're experiencing in school, where are the barriers? Create time for regular community sessions and individual reflection sessions. Do some of that street level data or empathizing with our students and with the users of our systems, and what are they encountering and how can we challenge that or address that. We can work as individuals and as communities to name, explore, and address exclusionary practices. We can work as individuals and communities to develop concrete and specific actions for addressing exclusionary practices and building inclusive committees. Or when an exclusionary practice is uncovered, we could provide opportunities for healing using community-based practices, such as restorative justice. So when we find a a barrier, or when we find a problem, what do we do about it, and how do we address it in a way that is restorative, in a way that is not punitive? So we have this video that I think I'm going to let you just save and watch on your own. It's about New York City transfer schools or alternative schools, and there's a little bit in there about the barriers that students were facing in their traditional schools and the ways that their transfer schools addressed it. But when I think about this challenge exclusionary practices guideline, I think about our school-wide implementation criteria. So it's kind of like almost a bridge from our universal design for learning guidelines that are about learning and about the classroom to our school-wide implementation criteria. And what the school-wide implementation criteria is, it's almost like the UDL guidelines for the school building and the school system. So not only does it outline what teachers need to be supported in implementing UDL in their classrooms, but it also talks about how do we make all the spaces and places and experiences in a school building designed for access and agency, designed with UDL. So when we think about barriers in designs, we might look for them in the goals. We might look for them in the materials. How is the content being represented? We might look for them in the methods. How is it being delivered? Or how's it being demonstrated, the assessments, or what is in the environment, and how does the climate and culture supportive of the learning? So when we're looking at learning experiences, we're kind of looking in those places. And when we're looking at schools, we might be looking in these other big chunks. What does the school culture and environment look like? What are on the walls? What does our spaces look like? How are we supporting teaching and learning? What are leaders doing, and how are they communicating with families? And how are we designing professional learning so that all teachers can have access? So I just wanted to point you to that because it's a good companion to this particular guideline around challenging exclusionary practices, and then wanted to give you guys a minute to reflect and share in the chat. What questions do you still have lingering about challenging exclusionary practices in order to build more accessible, inclusive spaces and systems? Or what barriers might stand in the way of challenging exclusionary practices? What are you encountering as you try to challenge them? So we got some things coming in the chat. Neurodivergent student voices as partners for building equitable STEM college classroom environments and not rehashing harms, not conducting damage-based research. Nice.
We got some links to that work further below in the chat, so thank you for sharing.
What are some other things folks are doing or other questions folks might have? We need a common language to help discern what we see because perception can vary widely across individual. Lack of knowledge and education of new faculty on the needs of students beyond the neurotypical is a barrier that Glenn's experiencing. Resistance around time it takes to create human-corrected captions for videos, even with starting with strong audio tools. Yeah. And we have a colleague that talks about accessibility, and he says he uses a term called born accessible because you cannot add the blueberries to the blueberry muffin after it's baked. You have to bake it in. So what are the ways that we can make those things up front? The difficulty of making some digital resources accessible. It can be a barrier. Getting buy-in for the upfront work, yeah. Yeah, we have to, Glenn likes the analogy, I have to cite Luis Perez.
Yes.
Sherry's been thinking, oh, I just lost it. thinking a lot about the implicit bias that can underpin exclusionary and unfair disciplinary practices. Yes, for sure.
Vonnie shared it's tough. Oops, now I lost it. There's so many good conversations going on. It's tough when we have separate settings because it becomes a default for suggesting to parents your child belongs somewhere else, not here.
Yeah. Reactive culture can be a barrier. Resources, funds, times, trained staff. Yeah. Having enough time to bake in the accessibility in UDL when contracts are strict with timelines for college faculty on when they start and end their work. Yeah. And that's a systemic barrier, right? So we want to encourage you to continue to think about systems through the lens of 3.0. And we talked about this a little bit in the Leading the Change webinar for school leaders. But thinking about those domains that we talked about, school culture, teaching and learning, leadership and management, and professional learning, and those big ideas, the big ideas that the 3.0 expansions are trying to push, right? True inclusion, honoring identity, addressing bias, designing for collective learning, exemplifying learner-centered practices. So as you think of those things that 3.0 is trying to push, think about either some systemic barriers you might see in those big buckets, school culture, teaching and learning, leadership and management, and professional learning, or changes that you have made or would like to make in those areas to push those 3.0 ideas. So we kind of wanted to leave you with that to chew on. And you can put some ideas in the chat. But we're getting towards the end of time. Let me just let you know what the rest of this is. So we have resources at the end here to support you. There's a guidelines website that has the graphic organizer. There are 8 languages available.
It's actually 10 now. We just added 2 more. Yes,
Oh, yeah?
Portuguese and German. So it's very exciting. And we have more that will be coming soon.
And the research pages that tells all the research that is behind these, some FAQs. If you're really one of those people that want to know exactly what changed from 2.2 to 3.0, we have a document on the website for that. And we have a rationale document that describes each of the updates if you're wondering why that change was made. There's these references. These are references that from the research that Jenna shared with us. And then just some other ideas to connect with us. You can email pl@cas.org if you want to get involved in any of our PL learning. There's a instructor-led online course coming up for Introduction to Universal Design for Learning. And possible next steps. Let's see. As you reflect on today, what has affirmed your thinking? What has pushed your thinking? And what might your learners need you to do next? So another little nugget to chew on as we go to the end. And thank you for joining us. So we'll hang on here if there's any other questions, because we got a couple minutes left. Just let us know.
Thank you all for joining. And I just am so appreciating all these comments in the chat. Thank you.
There's